Welcome to the International Schools Podcast. I'm your host, Dan Taylor, and on the podcast we discuss all aspects of technology and life in international schools, with new episodes live every 2 weeks. We focus on people currently working in international schools, and we talk about life in their current country, and then we dive into some specific topics. The podcast is sponsored by Apps Events. We're a Google for Education partner and made up of former educators, all experts in helping schools integrate Google into their schools and classrooms. All training is customized for every school to make sure it has lasting impact. We're also experts on online virtual Google training, and we can deliver all our certification bootcamps and training completely online to schools. We have teams in Europe and the Middle East, Asia and the US, and we can help you wherever you are. Check it out over at appsevents.com. We're also delighted to say we're now an ISTE partner, and we're delivering the ISTE Certified Educator worldwide with our subsidiary AE Learning. ISTE certification is a pedagogy-focused, vendor-neutral, professional certification aimed at educators wishing to transform their EdTech practice. We run 2-day certification bootcamps, which are amazing fun, great networking, and will give you a huge boost both to your career and for your school. Get all the info at aelearninglab.com. Finally, the podcast is brought to you by Acer for Education. People ask us what Chromebooks and Windows laptops we recommend for schools, and after literally trying them all, we always recommend Acer. If you'd like to get more information, please just leave your email at gg.gg/Acer Education, and we'll get straight back to you. We go to Acer HQ in Taiwan every year to be part of product discussions, and they are genuinely the best thought out, cost-effective, and durable devices out there. And now, on to the interview. Hello, welcome to the podcast. Today, I'm delighted to be talking to Laura White in the UK. Laura is a teacher in a few areas, mainly religious education and philosophy, and she's also a consultant. She's been involved in the Google Innovator program. I've met her once. We were just discussing at a Google event, and she's transitioning to be a full-time consultant in the new academic year. We're recording this in August 2020. So a lot to talk about, and welcome to the podcast, Laura.
Morning, Dan. Thank you very much for having me.
Cool. So Laura, I think obviously it was really interesting to talk about your background. I was looking here, you did a few things at university and then obviously went to teach at a couple of schools. So it'd be great to start at the beginning of I guess the story. Did you always knew you wanted to get into education, and did you study something with that in mind, or was it just something you got into later on?
I describe my entry into teaching as accepting my fate. So after graduation, I did an English degree at Cambridge, and I really didn't know what I wanted to do. So I spent my 20s kind of, singing in punk bands, training for priesthood, running my own business as a personal trainer. And I just couldn't kind of find my groove or find my thing. And I decided to give teaching a go. And I had a very interesting and entertaining introduction to the practicalities of teaching in quite a tough school in Eastbourne. And within a few minutes of being in the classroom for the first time, I knew this was for me. Right. And I haven't looked back. So I've been a teacher now for 15 years.
Okay.
Yeah, but it wasn't a direct path.
You must have done pretty well in school, because Cambridge, obviously Oxford and Cambridge are the hardest universities to get into in the UK. So I presume you've done pretty well up until that point.
Yeah, I think I was a very curious child. I think the International Baccalaureate program would have suited me much better than A-levels. Again, I just didn't really know what I wanted to do. I had interest in lots of fields. So I chose a pretty disparate selection of A-levels in the UK system. And actually, if the IB had been available to me, that would have suited me better, because I could have kept that broader, more holistic platform. As it was, I ended up trying to do physics and English and French and general studies and maths, and it was all a bit too much. So, yeah, not a direct route into religious studies teaching at all. But
yeah, I'm definitely I'm with you on IB. I think definitely for my own children, when they're young now, but I definitely would like them to do the IB. I think I don't like GCSEs and A-levels. I think it's crap. And I actually did similar. I did maths and physics and geography and general studies, and I wanted to do history, but I just
yeah,
it's too much work for me. It seemed like. So I just think it's If I take myself, I think I made a mistake. I don't think I should have done any maths or physics. I should have done history and a few other things I was really interested in. It was kind of my dad. I don't want to, not a sob story, I mean, I did okay, but like my dad kind of was like, oh, you should do science. It's more practical. You get a better job. And it's kind of silly to decide that at that age. It's better. I think the IB the diploma program has a bit more of a broader reach, for sure, more international.
Having taught on both programs, I think there are some students to whom the British system is very well suited and some students for whom it's really not. And I really enjoyed teaching. My first school that I worked at, a school called Ardingly College in Sussex, they offered both. So they had a dual program and students could select or be advised as to which program would suit them better. And I thought that was a really powerful setup. And, it's not one size fits all.
I mean, then you've got the other end of the spectrum, the American system, which is like first year or 2 years at university is still doing a range of subjects, which is completely different from the UK.
But there's this rise in liberal arts programs that UK students certainly are, I think, increasingly selecting those kinds of programs because they want to maintain that breadth. They're interested in lots of things. They don't want to specialize yet.
Yeah. Cool. Yeah. So you went into teaching after doing your degree in Did you do like a PGCE or what did you do as your teaching route teaching?
Yeah, so I did a PGCE at the University of Brighton. So I had a master's from Cambridge in English, and after about 10 years or so, I did my PGCE in religious studies because I've been very interested in theology and potentially training for priesthood. At the same time, I was doing a master's in pastoral theology at Heathrow College in London. So right. I'm always interested in learning. I'm always interested in developing as a person, and I think that approach comes across when you're teaching and when you're training people. Yeah. I'm curious, and I want my students and my people that I'm training to also be curious and have lots of questions. So yeah. I'm always spinning plates. I'm always learning something.
Cool. Yeah. Didn't I hear something that Heathrow College closed down or something recently? I'm sure I saw. Yeah.
Yeah, it's been the finest place to study philosophy and theology. Obviously, that's a subjective claim, but they have an incredible program. And I studied part-time there as a master's student with incredible people from all over the world. And I felt so kind of privileged to study there. And it's had funding issues effectively. And I'm not sure whether it's closed or reformed, but the story is not a good one. Yeah, it's a shame.
Cool. So what? So you went into teaching philosophy and religious education. Like, was it like a religious, like faith-based school or a regular school?
Yeah. So in the UK system, all students have to study religious studies up to the age of 16, regardless of the context. It's supposed to be 50% of that is supposed to be have a Christian foundation in terms of connectedness to our Christian heritage as a country. But if you're a faith-based school, you can select something else. Sure. The idea is that all children should have a bit of religious literacy, a bit of self-understanding, and a bit of other understanding. So my teaching has been in schools which have a Christian ethos, but they're not specifically faith schools. So that's not been by selection. It's just been schools that tend to value an academic approach to religious studies.
Yeah. Okay, cool.
But I've also, within those schools, taught lots of philosophy and ethics-based courses, which are more secular. So the British A-level is quite based in philosophy and ethics. And obviously the IB philosophy course is completely secular. And it's really fun teaching those things sort of side by side and moving between those worlds.
It's funny, yeah. I didn't do any. There was no option to do philosophy at my school, and yeah, I couldn't have even told you what philosophy was at 18, even in the basic level. Like I had no concept of it.
It's really nice. I mean, one of the things that I think St. Catherine's, where I've been for a long time, does really well is in year 9. So that's when the students are 13. They all follow a miniature PPE course. So they do a little bit of philosophy, a little bit of politics, a little bit of psychology, a little bit of economics. Yeah. In year 9, pre-GCSE. It's just that stage where they're just kind of opening up to the world, and it's giving them a bit of a vision beyond GCSE and saying, okay, GCSEs are coming, but after that, there's this whole rich world of stuff to learn about and know. So that's been a real privilege of teaching as well for the last. I don't know if within the IB you're familiar with the TOK program, the Theory of Knowledge program. So what we do at St. Catherine's, or have done, is like a little mini Theory of Knowledge program for them, just at that stage where they're just ready for it.
Sure.
That's been a lot of fun.
That's cool. So, at some point you seem to transition into like digital learning. Do you want to talk a bit about that, how you got into that kind of area?
Yeah, well, I think it's I think it's really interesting how the picture has changed in education in the UK, certainly. I'm sure it's not the same everywhere, but when I was training to be a teacher back when dinosaurs roamed the earth, about 15 years ago, I remember being described as an innovative user of ICT because I would actually turn the projector on and have some slides.
Right.
That was kind of, at that time, considered quite edgy and quite,
Yeah.
ooh, you're doing that. That's interesting. And I'm not sure how, in terms of how we're teaching our teachers and training our teachers, developing our teachers, how well we're moving beyond that.
Right.
So for me, it's always been about what serves the pedagogy, what serves my students. Why would I insist on my students manually handwriting notes while I'm talking when we know that they're going to learn better if they can listen, talk, do complete dialogue tasks with each other, answer questions and respond, and I can give them a notes pack at the end.
Yeah.
So they've got the notes on the screen and we can look at them and talk at them together. That's going to serve their learning better. So I was led into digital by the sense of my students needing something more, something in addition. And also by some of the real practicalities, I can save myself time.
Yeah.
I sometimes joke that I get into digital because I'm lazy. But actually, why would I reinvent the wheel every year if I've got the resource, if I've spent the time making that resource to the best quality I can 1 year, I can then adapt it and reuse it.
Sure.
Whereas if I'm not using any digital resources in my teaching, every single time I'm kind of dredging it up from my memory and from old handouts and all the rest of it. So I think my digital journey came from student need and from my desire to be efficient and to make the most of my time so that I could really focus on my teaching.
Right. Cool. Do you think that, so obviously as we record this, we're in the sort of time of coronavirus, do you think that that's actually in some ways helped people move digital? Because there's a huge amount. It was obviously the UK Department for Education sent an email out to pretty much all schools saying you need to choose Google or Microsoft, and they both have obviously, Google Classroom, Microsoft Classroom. There's a lot of, classroom management tools, obviously using Meet for like we're using right now for this to record this. Do you think this has actually forced a lot of teachers who were reluctant or resistant to it to get into sort of use digital tools in teaching?
I think there's a really well-known metaphor of the pencil, isn't there, for adopters in technology? You've got your sharp tip, your people who are out in front and they're risking everything and the tip sometimes breaks and doesn't work. And you've got your main body of your pencil and they're the people who are kind of following along behind the tip, sort of getting on board. And then you've got your rubber on the end or your eraser if you're American, the people who are really adverse to technology and they just want to turn it around and rub it all out and go back to the way things were. And I think that metaphor of the pencil is helpful because even though we've now everyone's moved without exception. Every teacher that I work with has adopted something new. Everyone's kind of got on board. We've still got a pencil, we've still got a range of perspectives. And it's really important when we're training teachers not to assume that everyone is now a digital evangelist. What I do think is interesting is often the teachers who were early adopters. I think sometimes there's a misunderstanding that goes with age. I don't think it does at all. I think it goes with more about your pedagogy, because I think sometimes your longest serving teachers are the people who are quickest to see the benefit for teaching and see the benefit for students and therefore to adopt it. But people who have been converted through this time are now some of the loudest evangelists. I can think of teachers who, I've been working on this project in one school for 5 years, and teachers who really had philosophical reservations to engaging with digital learning. They had concerns about student privacy or data. It wasn't that they didn't want to do it, they thought it wasn't the right thing to do.
Sure. Well, I agree, but some teachers do use that as an excuse as well. That I'm sure it's a minority, but some people definitely, they will come up with any excuse not to have to do this. And I think, and that's a minority. I think some do have the concerns you said, legitimately. The majority do, but I've definitely found some teachers, especially in England, most of the places that are just so resistant to it. They just don't want to use technology. Yeah,
and it's important that we recognise we're not suddenly in a magical wonderland where everybody's on board. People still have reservations, people still have hesitations, people still need training and support to make the right choices. I'm not really a massive fan of the SAMR model. It can be a useful way of starting conversations about people, and sometimes what's happened for some teachers is they've just translated what they were doing into digital without actually doing any kind of redesign or rethinking. So one of the measures I've always asked teachers is, how is this helping your learning? How is this giving students something better or saving you time? They haven't answered that question. They've just taken exactly what they were doing before, maybe lecturing to a room, and they're just lecturing on Zoom. And that isn't better. That isn't helping. Yes, it temporarily it's solving the temporary problem you have. But if you put that teacher back in the room, they're probably going to revert to what they were doing before. What we need to do is see how teachers can hold on to what's been effective learning and take that with them back into the real classroom. So I've run some workshops for teachers, reflective workshops. I think reflection is probably one of the big themes of my working life and one of my big approaches to stuff. In order to go forward, we've got to really take a moment to notice what's working and what isn't working. And one of the biggest challenges for teachers is how slammed they are and have been, and how hard people are working, particularly people who have children of their own at home and they're working from home. It's all been a bit hectic. We've done a couple of things where we've taken a day and we've asked staff to just talk with each other in context and establish what's worked. Just have a short period of time of sharing what's been really, really effective, then acknowledge what the challenges are, and then talk and plan about how to go forward. So this kind of look back, acknowledge the difficulties, and now let's go and do some concrete planning for September. And we want to plan in ways that are resistant to all situations. We don't know yet what situation we're going to be in September, do we? We've got, it's coming closer, but it's still unknown. So we need to be planning that protects learning in all eventualities. How can we plan learning which will be the learning itself will be resilient to circumstances? And that's quite a head shift. It takes some time. And if you don't do the preliminary work of what's gone well and what the challenge is, it's easy for that just to be hot air. So some of the training I've done over the last couple of months, I think I've had particularly good feedback from teachers, has been how much they've appreciated that moment to reflect, to say that it's been hard, and to think concretely about going forward.
Cool. Yeah, I just want to come back to one thing. Obviously, the SAMR model is something, in education technology we talk about all the time. But and you said you had some criticisms. Like, could you just I guess some people probably don't know what it is. There's definitely. Could you give a quick summary? And then I'm just keen to see what are your criticisms of it? Like what do you think isn't? Is it you think it's an oversimplification, or just? I'm very curious what you think.
Yeah, like all jargon, it's useful. But it's limited. So, for example, not everyone knows what you're talking about when you say SAMR. So if you stand up and do a talk,
I get criticised in this podcast. You jump in too much, and then we missed out the basics.
Yeah, exactly. And I appreciate that. It's a good thing to point out. Not everyone knows what that means, which is an initial problem. So SAMR, as I understand it, is a way of classifying digital transformation. It's when you're bringing technology into a classroom. The SAMR model suggests you can look at most of the things people might do and say it's either S, A, M, or R. It's either substitution, which is they would call a level 1. So you're taking something you're doing already and you're doing it exactly the same, but on tech. And then you've got augmentation. So that's level. And then the next, and there's a hierarchy. These are considered to be stages, developmental. And then you've got third level, which is modification, and fourth level, which is reimagination or some reinvention. So the suggestion is that if you're just substituting, it's not great. If you're augmenting, it's a bit better. If you're modifying, it's even better. And if you're reinventing, it's even better. So I like under the overarching principle, which is if you're going to invest the time in thinking about doing something differently, try and get the maximum benefit out of it. But I'm not sure that everything needs reinventing in order to be better. I'm sure that sometimes substitution isn't actually useful. So I just question the hierarchy, and I think it's not always necessary to reinvent everything. And for teachers who are under a time pressure, SAMR can seem like they're being criticised or what they're doing isn't good enough because it's only small steps. One of the things we've noticed definitely in schools is actually people need to take small steps. It needs to be manageable, and we need to break it down for them. I guess this goes back to the research part of my career, which we'll probably move on to in a minute, about what makes for effective learning and training. And certainly inspiration is important, and everyone needs to understand what the possibility is. That start with why is important. But if we don't make it practical and concrete and chunk it up, people won't do it.
Yeah, that's true. That's true.
So that's a brief summary of my sort of queries over summer. Something that I like a little bit better, if there's time for me to mention that, is probably TPAC.
Yeah, of course.
Where you've got these, and again, I'll just explain it briefly. Apologies to people who do know what this is. I don't mean to over-explain, but equally, if you don't, TPAC is a different way of approaching teaching with technology. And it says that teachers need 3 areas of knowledge to do this well. And why I like TPAC, so you've got your teacher knowledge, your sort of subject knowledge, your pedagogical knowledge in terms of how to be a good teacher. Sorry, your T is your technical knowledge, P is your pedagogical knowledge, and C is your content.
Yeah.
And without all 3 of those fields working, you're not going to be a great digital teacher. I like it because I think it references the side of professional knowledge. Lots of teachers have great experience, they have great understanding of pedagogy. And if we can layer the technology over the pedagogy and the content knowledge, then we can start to do something special.
Definitely. Yeah. If anyone's interested in learning more about these 2 things, we're running the ISTE certification for educators, which we're running now. That covers in the early stages very heavily TPAC model as well. So and of course SAMA, so basically they have kind of the 2 foundations of it, which is definitely the ISTE educator is a good technology agnostic certification to get a good overview of a lot of this stuff.
I think ISTE is really interesting, and I think it comes back around to what I was saying when I started teaching. Being an innovative user of technology was simply just having some.
Yeah. And
I think increasingly schools are looking for ways to talk about this stuff in a more informed way and to develop their teachers. And certainly I think the ISTE certification is something that's looking quite robust compared to some of the other offerings. Yeah, it's something I'm interested in finding out more about myself. I think for the schools in the UK who want to do interesting things with their teachers and who are ready for that, because not all schools are, I think ISTE is a really good route to explore.
Yeah, well, that's the thing. One of the reasons we became only the second ISTE partner outside of the US, and one of the reasons is they're looking to get more active in the UK, definitely, because there's nothing really similar that exists in the UK right now. So yeah, it's interesting to see how it's going to develop. I'm not sure right now, but there's definitely a lot of interest. We've got a couple of trusts who are already looking at doing the ISTE certification, so it could be interesting.
Yeah, I think it's important. We need frameworks.
Yeah, definitely. Well, even if you don't, if the thing about a framework is even if you don't adopt it, you've got as a point of reference to whatever you do decide to use. It gives you a starting point.
Totally, and I've been a fan of the things I've explored so far about ISTE, certainly.
Yeah. So, like you mentioned about obviously doing some consulting and stuff with other schools. How did you get into that, and what, obviously you had a job and you started doing some freelancing, in a kind of more practical way, people that might be looking to do this in a job, but what were the steps you took to sort of figure out what you could consult on and how you actually, managed to get the customers and stuff like that?
Yeah. So for me, it's been a very gradual process. First thing I did, and this is going to sound like I'm incredibly self-confident, which really isn't the case and certainly wasn't then. I kind of fell into my first opportunity and it's grown from there. So I actually went out to California and did a talk at a conference in Palo Alto. So a sort of Google summit.
Yeah.
And I talked about critical thinking and Google tools, which for me is part of this whole digital approach, is to be critical about our consumption of technology and how we use it. And I offered this talk and it was picked up. And I went out and I did it. And I was kind of surprised at myself for doing it. Now, that was a situation where you're not paid to talk. You get your summit attendance for speaking. So myself and my partner went out to California, and we actually did 2. We did one in Palo Alto, one in Orange County, and we had a nice little road trip between, and we made it a holiday. And it was a really great introduction to I think something teachers sometimes lose sight of if they're based in one school is context.
Sure.
And I tend to potentially underrate myself. I think we all do. It goes with the territory of being a teacher. You're always looking to improve, always self-critical. But to discover that people were interested in what I was saying and that I was saying something they hadn't potentially heard before or saying something in a way they hadn't heard before, made me realise it's about finding your voice, isn't it? It made me realise that actually I am bringing something interesting to this process.
Sure.
So from starting with some Google conferences, just as a kind of speaker, not keynoting or anything fancy, just doing some hands-on workshops in the US, did a couple in the UK, started to get asked to do sort of Google Innovator academies and that kind of process, and started building a PLN through Twitter. And then increasingly people would get in touch and say, we're in this situation as a school, could we have some advice? And I'd be like, yeah, that's fine. My school have been very, very supportive of me helping and doing kind of advisory voluntary things for local schools, but as long as they're not competitor schools. And they've been very supportive of me doing work for Google on the innovation academies. But it's come to a point where there's a sort of a moment. So I'm doing Ed.D at the moment, and that's quite demanding, more demanding than probably I'd anticipated. So in order to focus on that, it's reached a tipping point where I can pay the bills with training and consulting, and complete my research and move my work in the direction where I wanted to go. If I stayed any longer at my wonderful school, which I love, I wouldn't have been able to do those things. So I think the key part has been just growing it slowly.
Yep.
Not just launching out into the unknown and kind of expecting it magically to fall into place, being patient.
Yeah, definitely. Well, and it's like, I think you've done the right thing in that, like, people sometimes, I mean, I get asked all the time, how do I, all the time, like, how do I become, Ben gets asked it, an education consultant, and how do you do this full time, and how do you speak at events, and how do you do training? And the thing is, like, you have to build a network first. You almost without fail have to do things for free and still do things for free. I mean, I do things for free all the time, even though we run a business, which is consulting and training for schools, we still do things free every week. It's always like, it takes a long time, and it's great to build this network while you're still in the school. I think that's the best way to do it. Start speaking at events and start, doing some work. And, because also there's a practical thing, because everyone thinks they want to do something like this, but actually some people don't like the uncertainty. And if you actually do it a while and realize that, you've also got to be a salesperson, you've got to, if you're work for school, you've got to sell yourself into the job in the interview, but then that's not too much, sales to the school management, whereas when you do this kind of thing, it's always selling, you're always getting new relationships, and that's something that a lot of people, some people love it, some people don't. It's, it's good to try that out when you're in a school and then see if you like it as well.
Yeah, I think absolutely. I think there's two things I'd say. That definitely starting out, just getting some experience. Absolutely, as you say, being willing to learn, listening, and when you go to those kind of events, listening to everybody else, learning as much as you can. I have seen a few people kind of turn up, do their thing, and go. And at the summits, at the events, you can learn a huge amount, even if you think you know what that person's going to say. Watching how they say it, watching how they deliver it, watching how the room responds to how that delivery goes, looking at presentation skills, all of that stuff is all professional learning that teachers need. And even if you don't go on to consult, you take all those skills back into your classroom and become a better teacher. The other part of that is I was very lucky to have a very supportive school. And I know not everybody would have that. And I've always been very open with my leadership around what I'm doing outside school. And I think that relationship that I have there has allowed me to grow this. I know not everybody has that, so I'm very fortunate. When schools now are looking for advice, that's the part where I want to be generous and I want to help. I'm still learning how to balance that part with them actually then kind of following through and booking training.
Sure.
Because I do have this kind of good intentions attitude to things. I think it's really important to be as generous as you can be in life, but you've got to kind of get that balance right, haven't you?
Sure. Yeah. You need to make a living.
Yeah.
Totally. So I think it's like, it's very short-sighted, the school leadership, senior leadership, that doesn't let people go out and do it. I mean, for me, it seems insanity. Schools should be encouraging every teacher to go out and speak at events, and restricting that, it just seems like they're not thinking about the growth of the teacher themselves or what that can bring to the school. It happens all the time. People don't give themselves opportunities you've had, and I genuinely don't understand why leadership is like that.
I know that leadership and schools generally are under massive budgetary pressures to hold on to people, but I've seen some really creative responses to this in terms of training, and most of what I've done hasn't required cover or anything like that for the school to provide. So it's been quite easy for them to say yes to, because they've chosen to be supportive. But I know it's not the same for everybody. So I'm lucky. And if you're in a position where it's not the same, then try and find ways of doing it to make it as easy as possible for your school to support you.
Yeah, and you went to America for your first event, and that's for UK teachers. Always look at stuff in America, and in the US, there's a lot of events take place in the summer holidays. We do the most we do in the US in the summer. It's huge. PD is much bigger over there. It's much more common for teachers to do PD, and it's much more common in the summer. So that's kind of just a tip. People looking to represent the conferences, check out all the ones that take place in the summer. No time needed to take off work, and it's really a lot going on in the summer in the US, July, August.
And it was really exciting. It's a really interesting thing to do, and you can learn so much. And particularly if you are UK focused, getting outside the UK bubble and doing some training, in Europe, or doing some training in the US, or just attending those conferences and speaking, it will widen your perspective on education, deepen your practice, help you to be even more thoughtful about your own classroom and your own students. It's a win-win.
Definitely. So it's not now you're in the process of going to do this full time, or you're actually doing it right now. How's that going? Like, is it? Are you looking forward to? Obviously, you've chosen a kind of a fairly interesting time given the COVID. And I know as well. One thing I want to mention: you're also doing this digital equity stuff, which is really, really keen to hear more about that. But how are you finding it? Transferring to doing this full time.
Yeah, it's really early days. Literally, we broke up at school on the 14th of July, so. Yeah. I decided to give myself a little holiday because it's been quite an intense term one way and another. So now I'm getting started more formally. It's exciting. It's a little bit nerve-wracking. I've got the calendar for the year, and it'll be the first time for me in a long, long time that September hasn't been back to school.
Yeah.
And just psychologically, that's a huge shift to make where I will determine my week.
Yeah.
One of the biggest drivers is to try and complete my research. I'm doing an Ed.D. at the Institute of Education in London as part of UCL, and it's a really demanding course, and I have found it very difficult to do it to my satisfaction alongside working a very full-time job in a very busy school and doing a bit of consulting, and doing the other things that I do. I do crazy ultra marathoning and all kinds of stuff. So for me, part of coming out of full-time school is to have time to really focus on this research alongside the consulting.
Yeah. To ask about the research, I'm very curious. Like, first of all, how would you describe the difference between doing an Ed.D. and a PhD? Because obviously there are two main options for a doctorate in education. Like, what are the differences, and why did you choose this one?
Yeah, so I had a good look at things. I really was feeling about sort of 5 years ago that I needed to invest in myself professionally and sort of make progress. And I could see various options to do that. And I'm always wanting to study. I'm intellectually, academically curious. So I thought a PhD would be the thing to do. And I looked at various options. And for a start, most of them seemed to be full-time. Most of the ones I wanted to do seemed to be full-time. And there's no way I could have come out of education and just fully funded a PhD for 6 years, probably, that would take to do something. So the PhD is a much more sort of traditional process. You find a supervisor and you basically write, or you carry out a research process and you write it up. The Ed.D. is described as a professional doctorate. It's very much tied to your working practice. So it's designed to be done alongside teaching or leading a school or whatever you do. And it's anchored to your work. So rather than one big piece of writing, the first 3 years is essentially a research training program. They teach you to be a researcher. They teach you to write research projects. They teach you to write proposals, to do methodological studies. They teach you all this stuff, which otherwise someone like me, coming from an arts background, would have no clue about. Yeah. And you complete these chunks of research, which you write up. And once you've completed the first 3 years, you then write your thesis. But your thesis is much shorter than a standard PhD thesis. So up to now, I've done, so September will be my 4th year, and an Ed.D. is 4 to 7 years part-time.
Right.
So you don't have to give up your job unless you choose to, in my case. You should be able to manage it alongside teaching. I think part of why I struggled with it is that I had a number of roles at my previous school, and I was consulting. So it was I just need the headspace to do it well. Interested in, also I chose the Institute of Education in London. They are the global leader for education research. They have a huge program of teacher training there, and one of the aspects I want to look at is how we train and develop teachers. So being there makes sense. And they also have the UCL Knowledge Lab, which is looking at lots of connected things to my area. So I'm looking at digital learning and thinking skills. And this whole aspect of how do we learn digitally, how do we teach digitally, how are digital tools changing teaching and learning, how can we help teachers develop their skills and reflect, and how can we help students learn more effectively.
Yeah.
It's been very challenging. I've really enjoyed it. I've learned a lot. What I've done primarily so far is look at, basically, I've created or developed a research tool for looking at digital learning in the classroom. So as a digital learning lead, I would quite often go into a classroom, having coached or trained a teacher a little bit on the tool they want to use, and I'd just support them in delivering it, or do some digital observation.
Yeah.
And I don't know about you, but if you've got into that situation and you've sort of sat there in the classroom, watched the lesson, tried not to kind of interfere too much in the progress of the lesson, tried to sort of sit back and let it happen, and then at the end had that conversation with the teacher. It's really interesting how that conversation goes.
Yeah.
You can say, how do you feel that was going? How do you feel the kids use their devices? How did that lesson go as planned? And the teacher can have a whole perspective, which can be very different to the perspective I might have had at the back of the room.
Sure.
So you can end up with this conversation that's quite airy-fairy, and actually the conversation can be much more useful if it can have some sort of tethered basis in the events of the lesson.
Right.
So without getting overly technical, there's a research method called stimulated recall that education researchers have been using for ages, where you basically video the lesson and then you do a process of talk through. So you look over the video together with the teacher, you ask them prompting questions, and you're encouraging them to remember and recall the events of the lesson with more clarity because it's anchored. So all I've done is made a digital adaptation to that, where we've recorded all the kids' screens. So the Cats is an iPad school, so they've all got iPads. So we used Apple Classroom, which, just if you're not familiar with it, all it does is kind of show you a thumbnail of the kids' screens during the lesson. So I screen recorded that with a lesson soundtrack. And then you're saying to the teacher, okay, let's look together at the events on the students' screens during that lesson. Tell me, why did you choose to do that way? What do you see here? What do you think child X is doing at this moment? And you can have a much more useful, concrete conversation. Sometimes it's helping people to realise that their kids are really focused and really tuned in and really attentive. Sometimes it's pointing out that maybe, this child who's currently very quiet at the back is on Minecraft. So it's not Big Brother at all. It's not assessing their competence as a teacher. It's framing within a reflective conversation what they're doing really well, letting them see. That's the key part. It's letting them see for themselves, and have their own informed reflection with a professional colleague on the content and the style of the lesson and how it's gone. It's been really, really interesting. I've done through 2 cycles of research so far with teachers, and we also done it with some students. That's been really nice too. Student just uses their own little screen and talks over the lesson in the same way. Cool. But every teacher I've done it with has gone, this is going to change how I teach. And every student I've done it with has gone, oh, that's interesting. I didn't realise I did this thing this way. So it can be a real confidence booster for some people. It can also just be that kind of little nudge that what we've encouraged them to do in training, or what we're sort of suggesting that they do, when they do it, it works. They can see it for themselves.
Yeah.
So digital observation is kind of what I'm focusing on mostly. We've also done a couple of little projects with sort of more general research in school. I don't know if that's interesting or...
Sure, yeah. I'm actually just curious, like, just in terms of the practicality of doing the Ed.D, like, do you actually, do you have to go there periodically? Is there any kind of residence in the summer, or do you go there once a week or once a month? Like, how does it actually work? Or is it all online? Like, what's the structure of it? And is there like a cohort you all start at the same time?
Yeah, so it depends where you do it. So for the Ed.D at UCL, in each year, there's progressively less and less contact time. So during year 1, we went up every Friday, and school released me every Friday to go up, and then it becomes every, once a month, and then it's, once a half term. And you have these day contacts, which are face-to-face. There is an online cohort. You can do it all online and by distance too. It's very flexible. There's a cohort of people who all start together, but actually, because people take different options as it progresses, it sort of shakes down. So you end up with people in your network who are in year 4 or in year 2. Right. But the cohort's a very strong part of it. And since COVID in February, it's been really noticeable how that's changed, because we haven't had some of the face-to-face contacts we would normally have.
Sure.
And it took UCL a little while to kind of scramble their online provision and provide some online options instead. UCL also has a really good program of courses that you can access, which are online and face-to-face around research training. So if you know you've got a particular need to develop a set of skills, or you want to look at a particular theory, you can find online or face-to-face courses to supplement what you're getting through the direct program. So it's pretty flexible. For most of my cohort, their schools are supporting them either with fees or with time, not necessarily with both.
Yeah.
And so in my case, the school supported me with time, but I paid my own fees. That's fine.
Yeah, definitely. And so you were saying about the general education stuff you're doing as part of it as well.
Yeah, so I've been out of formal education for quite a while. I did my master's just as I was doing my PGCE, so about 15 years ago. And I certainly found some things, just like academic referencing, just it's fiddly, it's important to get it right. So I went and I chose to do an extra module on that. There are reading groups on particular educational theories, or like critical realism, or all kinds of different things. So you can put together your own program. As part of the Ed.D, you have to accumulate a certain number of points for each year. And some of those you get from the face-to-face contacts, and some of those you get from adding your own additional courses. So I've done additional courses in data analysis and evaluation. I'm an English and theology graduate. You give me a pile of stats, it doesn't really mean a great deal to me, but now I can put that stats into a statistical modelling program, and it helps me to analyse the data that I'm drawing out of those conversations with teachers after the research. So it's really flexible. It's suited me quite well. But I now feel that I need more time than I have if I'm going to keep teaching and coaching in school. Something's got to give.
Sure. Look, I think obviously we're getting up to time. It's been super interesting. I think the final thing about digital equity, a bit about you. We will talk a little bit about, because you mentioned that's something you've been interested in and working with schools on. Do you want to say a bit about what you've done in that area?
Yeah, I'm just getting started on this. So I guess this probably goes back to international schools, kind of coming full circle. Having worked in international schools and been part of those kinds of overseas trips that international schools often do, I was really struck initially by a trip to Kenya a while ago, how our devices that we have, they don't disappear. When we recycle them, when we upgrade, they filter down. And so back in Kenya 13, 14 years ago, probably, newly qualified teacher, I was astonished to see the number of mobile phones in the street, and things like M-Pesa and the mobile banking that they've got there. They've entirely just skipped the landline phase and gone straight to mobile. And it really strikes me that there is a massive opportunity for education to mobilize itself to the point of need without, so there's massive projects going on. There's a huge program with UNICEF right now and a number of other ones where people are trying to make education accessible through mobile devices. So I remember sitting in a pavement cafe in Bethlehem on the Wi-Fi, sending a message home and watching the kids come down the street and slowly right down as they walk past the cafe, hook into the free Wi-Fi, walk very, very slowly past the front of the cafe. The cafe owner would come out and chase them away, and they'd leg it. And 10 minutes later, they'd be back again. And they're obviously these kids are improvising and innovating to get access to the things that they want. So why can't that be education? So I don't have a huge amount of experience in this area, but it's definitely where I want to go. And I'm hopeful that my research and consulting will help me to move in that direction. I'm looking to work on those kind of big projects. UNICEF has huge recruitment. So I'm trying to position myself to get access to one of their programs or work with them. They use educational consultants as an educational consultants roster in Europe, based out of Geneva. That's sort of one of my next targets, definitely.
And UNICEF, that's fascinating. Do they, consultants who work with UNICEF, do you get to kind of go in the field to certain countries to work on projects, or is it online, or is it a variety of things?
It varies. So every single day there's a huge list of opportunities, and they will indicate whether it's remote or local. They'll also indicate whether you need to be, a resident of a Philippines native, because some of the work is particularly for local people in that community. At the moment, they're doing a huge project with mobile education in Malawi. So at the moment, they're looking for people to build that platform. But the next thing they're going to be looking for is people to help teachers use it. And that's, I want to be right there, front of the queue going, yes, this is something I'm passionate about. This is something I think is really important. We can change life for the better with education. Statistically, we know, particularly if we focus on the education of girls, we know that transforms communities because girls typically pass their education on to their children in a different way. There's so much good stuff to do. And when we're in schools, training teachers and talking to teachers and coaching people, if we can tether together all of these ideas around, let's be critical consumers of technology, let's use what benefits the learning, let's be informed by research, let's have meaningful conversations and reflective conversations about technology, teachers can transform their classrooms, children's learning can be transformed, and the whole world just kind of opens out gradually. So, I am an idealist, I am an optimist. I do think we can make a difference in the world, but it takes a bit of time, and that's why I'm coming out of full-time education, to give myself time to try and pull all these pieces together. Yeah.
Cool. Well, really interesting. Best of luck with your freelancing. The UNICEF stuff's really interesting. I'm going to check it out. Thanks for coming on the podcast. Where can people get in touch with you? What's the best place to look?
Thanks very much for having me, and thanks for letting me chatter on about things that I'm interested in. I hope it's interesting for your listeners. I do have a website, thinkteachtech.co.uk, or you can hit me on Twitter, which is also at thinkteachtech. Always interested to connect with people who are, thinking about educational research or equity or just coaching or just want to have a talk about ideas. So it'd be lovely to hear from people.
Great. Well, Laura, huge thank you again. And I'll put the links in the show notes to all the things you said, your website and Twitter and everything. Thanks again, and all the best for the future.
Thanks for having me.